Hey guys, so this slideshow is going to be talking about the people who lived in America before European contact. So Native American life all the way from 12,000 BC when the first people crossed over into America to 1492 when Columbus makes contact with the New World. So the first Americans crossed over from the Old World into the New World about 14,000 years ago, and they crossed via the narrow space between Russia and Alaska, which we now call the Bering Strait. And so some people think that they did this using boats, but most people believe that 14,000 years ago, during the last ice age, the sea level was actually lower because more water was trapped in glaciers. And what this meant is that there was actually land connecting Russia and Alaska, which allowed these people to cross on foot into the New World. Of course, when the Ice Age ended, not long after, this caused the sea level to rise back up, trapping these people who had crossed in the New World. So these people who were hunter-gatherers and who migrated as part of their lifestyle, it didn't take them very long to fill up the rest of the New World. Within 2,000 years, both North America and South America had been populated by hunter-gatherers. So these guys came over with Stone Age technology. That means they had mastered fire, they had mastered making certain stone tools like arrowheads, and they had also figured out how to make cool tools out of bone, like fish hooks and sewing needles and stuff like that. But they didn't really have much else besides that. But using these simple technologies, they were able to survive and flourish in the New World. Of course, there were not that many of them in total. Even when they had populated all of the New World, anthropologists believe that there were only about 10 million hunter-gatherers in the ancient New World total. And that's simply because hunter-gatherers can't create as much food as farmers can. Eventually, some people in the New World figure out how to domesticate and utilize certain species of plants and animals. And this is important because it allows for people to transition from hunter-gatherer societies to sedentary farming societies, which leads to a big growth in human population. But they actually get a really late start compared to other places of the world. So in the Middle East, for example, people figured out how to domesticate certain species up to 10,000 BC. Whereas the New World doesn't get started until 5,000 BC. So this puts the New World farmers at a 5,000-year disadvantage to farmers in the Old World. One place that domesticates a couple species is Mexico, where they have corn, beans, squash, peppers, and turkeys. And the other place where agriculture develops is Peru, where they develop also corn, beans, and squash. And then on top of that, the potato, the llama, and the guinea pig. But so it's important to note that neither place has access to big draft animals like exist in the Old World. For example, even though in Peru they have the llama is not big and strong enough either to carry a person on its back, and nor is it strong enough to pull a cart long distances. And so this limits development in Mexico and Peru in certain important ways, because it makes it harder to transport people and goods long distances. So from these centers of Mexico and Peru, agriculture begins to spread out, and it spreads north into North America only at 1,200 BC. So that's not really very long ago at all. So it makes sense that North America is even further behind in terms of technological development. So with the spread of agriculture, you start to see the emergence of civilizations in America. And a civilization is simply a complex society that exhibits certain signs of technological development. And it's all rooted in the population growth that agriculture makes possible. And so in these civilizations, you start to see technologies like the use of silver and gold, the building of enormous walls and pyramids, the development of systems of writing, stuff like that. So the two major American civilizations that we're going to talk about today, and the two civilizations that Europeans come into contact with, are the Aztec, who lived in Mexico, and the Inca, who were centered in Peru. So the Aztecs, as just mentioned, were located in central Mexico. And you can see on that map there, that little red splotch shows you where the Aztec Empire was located. And so the foundation of this civilization was their very productive agricultural system. So using corn, using beans, using squash, and using peppers, they had figured out how to produce a whole bunch of food. And through figuring this out, they had caused the population of central Mexico to skyrocket up to 20 million people, which was a whole lot for back then. And one thing they did that was interesting is in swamps and lakes and other areas where you couldn't normally grow food, they would build artificial islands and then out of the mud from the bottom of these lakes. And then using those islands that they'd created out of this mud, they would grow an incredible amount of food on this really fertile mud from the bottom of swamps and lakes and stuff. But the other backbone of the Aztec Empire, along with this really productive agriculture, was warfare. And so the Aztec Empire was an empire based on basically taking stuff from its neighbors. So out from the central city, they would send these raiding bands, and they would defeat the other tribes around them. And rather than, building a fort there or taking over that territory, what the Aztecs would do is they would simply demand certain goods be sent back to them. Food, timber, luxury items, stuff like that. But also they would demand human captives. And what this meant was that they would be taken back to the capital, Tenochtitlan, for either slavery or human sacrifice, and which we'll talk about in a second. But first, let's talk about Tenochtitlan. So you see that there pictured in the top right, and Tenochtitlan had a population of almost 30,000 people when the first Spanish saw it. And it was situated in the middle of the lake, surrounded by floating gardens. And in the center, it had a huge complex of temples. And these temples were the ritual sites where human sacrifice was carried out. And so many societies throughout history have practiced human sacrifice, but few ever took it to the extent that the Aztec Empire did. They believed that their gods demanded and required the sacrifice of human beings in order to continue to give the Aztecs the blessings that they needed. And so the Aztecs would frequently fight wars with their neighbors simply to capture people, bring them back to the capital city where they would execute them. And some accounts show that over the course of a 4-day religious festival, more than 80,000 people were sacrificed at the top of these temples. Needless to say, this practice made the Aztecs somewhat unpopular among their neighbors. Major civilization of the New World was the Incan Empire, and they controlled a vast swath of western South America where the Andes Mountains run, all along the western edge like a spine running down the back. And so they were a mountain empire. The lowlands to the other side were uninhabitable jungle, right? Just thick and dense and swampy. But the mountains were actually very productive. And so all along this chain of mountains, the Inca built cities and roads and temples. And there's actually a road running along the mountains that you can find in certain places that still exists from where the Inca built it. So the leader of the Incan Empire was called basically the Inca, which meant the ruler. And he was revered as the god of the sun by the other Inca. and he had absolute control over his kingdom and could basically command anything that he needed done. And so the Inca are widely considered to be the most advanced civilization of the New World, mostly because of their feats in engineering and in metalworking. The Inca had figured out how to use copper, how to use silver and gold, and they had also figured out how to build roads, to build these incredible mountain cities, like the one pictured here. This is the famous Machu Picchu. And they had also figured out how to engineer the landscape using this system called terracing. And that's where you take a slope and make it into little steps. And this allowed them to farm even on the steepest mountain sides. In North America, Native American societies never reached the same degree of complexity and technological development as those in Mesoamerica and South America. But by the time the Europeans reached the New World, we have begun to see the development of some more complicated societies. And this is all linked with the spread of corn. Remember, corn is the backbone of the other societies in North America. And as it spreads northward, it allows for the people in North America to begin to go through the same process of population growth and civilization. And this happens first in the desert regions where today New Mexico and Arizona are located. And the Pueblo Indians learn how to channel the river onto their fields in order to water their corn in the middle of a desert. And using this technique, they're able to support large settlements, and they live in these unique adobe buildings that they build into the side of cliffs, which you've probably seen and heard of before. Something you may not have heard of before is there was actually a civilization along the banks of the Mississippi River that was based on corn and bean production that began to build pyramids. So they were taking the first big steps towards civilization that other societies had taken thousands of years before, like the Aztecs, and like before them, the Egyptians, at building these enormous structures. But for reasons we don't really understand, they had gone into a sharp decline around the year 1300, and by 1500 they had more or less disappeared before they had ever gotten a chance to encounter European explorers. On the East Coast, agriculture didn't really get started until 1000 AD. That is only 1,000 years ago. And so we saw only the very beginnings of agriculture and civilization on the East Coast. Their communities remained small, and instead of becoming full farmers, what they did is they mixed farming and hunting and gathering together into a single way of life. And so they would still move around somewhat within the forests on the East Coast, growing corn, but also hunting deer and other animals. And one thing that this resulted in is, since they were constantly on the move, these eastern Indian tribes never developed an idea of land ownership. Basically, everybody in a single group would share an entire chunk of land. Nobody said, like, okay, this is mine, this is yours, let's divvy it up. And this is an important thing to recognize, because when Europeans get to the East Coast, which is where the first settlements are, and they try to buy land from the Indians, basically they have no idea what they're talking about. And this leads to some confusion and ultimately to bloodshed and tragedy. Anyway, that's all you guys need to know for the pre-European Americas. I want you all to remember what the Aztec Empire and what the Inca Empire were all about. They'll be important in a couple of classes when we talk about the Spanish settlements of the New World. And I also want you guys to remember communal land ownership and what that's all about.